everyone. I'm Dr. Thomas Riva, Director of Religious Studies at Purdue in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies. This afternoon's lecture is funded by the Religious Studies program at Purdue University in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and supported by the Aquinas Educational Foundation. Today is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Phil Dorrell. Dr. Dorrell is an associate professor at Wofford College, and his research interests range over the history of modern Turkish Islamic theology, classical Islamic systematic theology in Arabic, and Eastern Christian theology in classical Arabic. He is the author of the book Islamic Theology in the Turkish Republic, and many other articles that have appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Journal of Islamic Studies, Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies, Contemporary Islam, The Wheel, and Public Orthodoxy, among others. Dr. Dorrell's visit is something of a homecoming. Phil is a Boilermaker, who many of us in religious studies, philosophy, and history taught when he was here. And he received his bachelor's degree in religious studies at Purdue. I'm proud to say we can count him as one of our most successful graduates. Today, Dr. Dorrell will give us a presentation representative of his interests and attempt to revision Eastern Orthodox and Muslim relations from the perspective of Eastern Christian experiences. Let us give Dr. Dorrell a warm Purdue welcome.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun to be here. Start my timer so I don't take too long. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is basically just provide my take on what I think the history of Eastern Christian Muslim relationships can tell us that the history of Western Christian Muslim relationships cannot. So basically, we're familiar with the Western Christian side of things. I'm going to provide something a little bit different. Everyone who has studied religion at an American university, like this one, is familiar with at least one basic distinction, the difference between descriptive and prescriptive approaches to religion. This distinction is also often called the difference between religious studies and theology, the former being anthropological or a cultural studies approach, talking about religion as a human cultural product, something we can study whether we believe it or not. The latter, the prescriptive, being something where you talk about the faith that you yourself hold to either propagate it or convince someone else to have it. My talk today will offer a critique of this basic distinction that we're familiar with in this methodology and offer a different approach in the study of religion with three phases to it. The first, I'll talk about how Islamic studies in the West is rooted in this distinction, but it comes from Western Christian historical experience of Islam, or more precisely, the lack thereof, the fact that Western Christians historically don't have much experience of Muslims, and talk about it from that standpoint. And then the second thing I'll try and do is talk about a way of talking about Islam that's based on the Eastern Christian experience, what I'm going to call a theology of shared lives. And I'll give two quick examples from the medieval Muslim empire, the Abbasid Empire, and the contemporary Ukraine. My argument summary is this: that the Western field of religious studies in general, and the Western field of Islamic studies in particular, describes interreligious relationships using dichotomies such as tolerance or persecution, native or foreign, ally or enemy, because the Western Christian experience of Islam is distant and foreign, because Western Christians for over 1,000 years never had much close experience living with Muslims at all, with a few exceptions, but not many. By contrast, Eastern Christians have lived closely with Muslims since the beginning of Islam in the 600s, late 500s, 600s. And the study of this history reveals a more nuanced and true-to-life approach to interreligious relationships that breaks down these kind of like dichotomy where we're trying to always ask ourselves, do Muslims and Christians have this experience of total persecuting the other, or total conflict, or total peace and harmony? We sort of go back and forth on those. But this is abstracted from everyday life, because everyday life is something that most Western Christians don't have an experience of with the Muslims until recently, maybe the past 50, 60 years at the most. So this is what I call, this history of personal interaction produces what I call theologies of shared lives, which is what happens when the nuances of everyday interactions occur, and then you think about these things from your faith perspective, and it produces something very different from sort of abstract comparison, or the doctrine's the same, or the doctrine's different, whatever. What I call these theologies of shared lives are where you intentionally preserve your own worldview. You have no interest in questioning your own worldview, but you're interested in preserving the integrity of somebody else's. So it doesn't require a questioning or breaking down of yourself, or a suspending of your own sense of self, like the descriptive religious studies approach, but it also doesn't require you to try and argue against or for your own position, like a prescriptive theological one. It's something different. So if you're familiar with Islamic studies, Edward Said in his famous book Orientalism argued Western Europe's view of Muslims are shaped by what he called an ontological distinction, this divide between East and West. And it's because as far as Western Islamic studies is concerned, the difference between Islam and Christianity is between East and West. As the scholar Maxime Rodinson once famously put it, since the 11th century, Islam was seen in Europe as an enemy above all else, a rival civilization that for over half a millennium had threatened Europe because of its superior geopolitical status. So for like the first 500, 600, 800 years of Muslim history and Western Christian history, Muslim empires in the East were much more powerful than Western Europe. And that was the way that Western Christian experienced Islam as this looming geopolitical imperial threat, because it was for them. By the time you get to the modern period, 19th century, modern Orientalism, the situation's reversed. Western empires are now conquering and dominating Eastern Muslim societies, but they preserve the same Eastern-Western dichotomy. The Western Christians still think of Muslims and Christians as an East-West bifurcated rival civilizations. They have their own place. They live in their own place. They don't talk or experience one another. The Western academic field of Islamic studies has developed out of this context of unfamiliarity with Islam. Therefore, Western Islamic studies scholars have tried to develop a field to understand a foreign civilization, to understand a civilization they simply don't know much about because they've never lived there. They don't talk to people there. They never had a reason to. So in the same way, the religious studies descriptive, prescriptive distinction is helpful because it aids the Western Christian researcher in trying to suspend the prejudice that they have because they just have never experienced Muslims on a day-to-day basis. And so the descriptive approach, sort of suspending your own worldview, your own theology before you look at someone else's, is helpful in that tradition, that context, because it helps you suspend or try and suspend those prejudices inherited over many centuries. The most famous example of this is a book by Marshall Hodgson, who's a famous Islamic studies scholar in the American context, who called this historical humanism, to basically talk about Islamic civilization as a major human historical phenomenon, to be appreciated as a human phenomenon, but to basically take away our theological, metaphysical assumptions before we look at it to avoid prejudice or reading ourselves into their history. But if you shift to Eastern Christian history, which is what I wanted to hear, especially Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the frame is the complete opposite. From the beginning of Islam, Eastern Orthodox Christians have not only known about the faith, they have known Muslims personally. As I forgot to put in the presentation, but I'll point out here, the famous specialist in Eastern Christian Muslim relations, Sidney Griffith, argued that throughout the Middle Ages, over 50% of all Christians in the world lived in Muslim territories. You look at Eastern Christian experience in Islam, they have known Muslims personally from the beginning of Muslim history, and there's two broad categories of Orthodox Christian Muslim shared living that I sort of think about when I'm doing my research: the imperial context and the post-imperial national context. So basically, a context where we're talking about an empire where, on the one hand, Muslims are in control and Orthodox Christians are a large minority subject to that empire. And in the flip side, the Russian Empire, this is the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Muslim Turks for over 600 years, with the ruling class of Muslims, with the largest minority in that territory being Eastern Orthodox Christians. And then in the flip side, the Russian Empire, where you have a ruling class of Orthodox Christians with a Muslim subject minority. So I'm going to briefly go to these maps very quickly. If you look, the orange, the little brown and orange area is the beginning of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century. It expands out from that territory. The further out it goes, it absorbs almost entirely Eastern Orthodox territory. So by the time you get to the high point of the Ottoman Muslim imperial state in like the 1700s, the largest non-Muslim population there are Eastern Orthodox Christians. And all of the Balkans is at least half or majority Eastern Orthodox, but ruled by Muslims from the imperial center. And then just to give a few more close-up examples, if you look at population data from like 1906, in this case, the green here are Muslims. These are major cities or major provinces. Green is Muslim. The gold and purple are various kinds of Orthodox. So you've got a very, very close numbers of people, right? Like half and half, 60, 40, 40, 60. Some Orthodox majorities, like in kind of Skopje, in contemporary Macedonia. And then if you look at a village level, I don't want to pass my slide for some reason. There we go. It gets even closer. So this is a lot of colors and dots. So like, give me a second. But the green here again is Muslim. The other colors are various kinds of Orthodox Christian. But the point here is that these are villages in what's now contemporary Macedonia, northern Greece. But they're like, we're talking villages that are just a few miles apart. They're right next to each other. And some of them are mixed, where the villages literally both Orthodox Christians and Muslims living together. This kind of situation persisted for centuries, from the 1300s up until the 1900s. So for century after century after century, you have places where Muslims and Orthodox are living, I mean, within a few miles or next door inside the same village for such a long period of time. It's longer than like the US has even existed, for instance, right? It's a very, very long history. To use the Russian imperial example, Russia also starts as an imperial power when it expands beyond a little tiny green and yellow area from the state of Muscovy into a much larger imperial state. It expands north first, but then the green territory below its older central lands is all or mostly Muslim territory. So the first minority that Orthodox Christians rule over in the Russian imperial state are Muslims, Sunni Muslims, the Tatar. And so for the majority of that empire's history, their largest subject population, or at least the second or I'm not sure if Catholics were first, but at least the first or second largest were Muslims, again, for centuries, beginning in the 15th, I think it's late 1500s that the Khanate of Kazan is conquered by the Muscovites. So for at least 400 years, you have, again, mixed villages, close contact, century after century for a very, very long time. And the contrast I'm drawing here is that there's just no parallel to this whatsoever in the West. None. Even to this day, there isn't. The closest thing you'll find to this in the West are like large cities, maybe New York, London, Paris. But that's it. We have nothing like this in Western history, except for maybe the past few decades. This is a very new thing. So examples of the possibilities of the kind of interaction you could have in these histories, and this is an example of the Russian Empire, where just quickly, you've got the red on the left is the 1897 census for Orthodox, on the right, the same central territory, green, for Muslim populations. They overlap quite a bit, in other words. The kinds of interactions you can have, there's a sort of standard set of range of possibilities that we know people did amongst one another. And one of the most famous examples are mutual, widely attested centuries-long traditions of mutual celebration of religious holidays. So the end of Ramadan or Easter or Pascha, people would celebrate together, both Muslims and Christians. And this was normal for, again, many, many centuries. It's died out almost entirely now, but it was a routine feature of village life and neighborhood life for a long time. All the way up until you have, in some cases, Muslims and Christians sharing the same saints' tombs and sacred sites. So the tomb of a Greek saint in the middle of Anatolia, Muslims would decide they like it too. They all start doing pilgrimage there and vice versa. And this was, again, a routine sort of feature of life for many, many centuries. Ethnographic study of the remaining communities that still preserve these practices reveal still kind of shared lifeways, close friendships that are some of the last remaining traces of this ancient multi-ethnic and multi-faith space that's become much less common in the 20th century to the present, and is also subject to a lot of nostalgia as nationalism has made these relationships more complicated. But the reason why these once common and unremarkable interactions disappeared is because of equally important kinds of problems, which is outbreaks of violence that have plagued the modern era, including genocide and mass violence against Muslims in the Caucasus Mountains by the Russian Empire and Russian Federation, genocide and mass violence against Greek and Armenian Orthodox by the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic, and then genocide against Bosnian Muslims by the Serbian Orthodox in the 90s, and atrocities against Middle Eastern Christians by ISIS in the 2000s. This is the kind of the dark inverse of the nostalgia for the imperial period above that leaves a persistent process of cultural trauma that a very important scholar in Turkish, Özgür Kaymak, has called, quote, the accumulation of history within memory. So what I'm trying to point out here too is that we're not talking about either this sort of paradise of coexistence or a constant set of persecution, but like everything in between, everything from like outright sharing of religious practices to genocide, ethnic cleansing, and most things being much more in the middle, in between. But as her book, this is a very important book on the left here, talking about minorities in Istanbul, where she talks about how the accumulation of history within the memory of minorities, Orthodox Christian minorities in Muslim societies, preserves cultural trauma that can be centuries old, along with preserving nostalgia. about the positive and the good times. So to put it simply, having lived together for centuries, Muslims and Eastern Christians have treated each other in every possible way that human beings are capable of treating each other. Every mode of human behavior is represented. So what I mean by shared life here is neither a utopia of equality or a dystopia of persecution, but just human life. And that kind of nuance is what is missing, I think, in Western discussions of Islam, which are always looking for examples of perfect coexistence or constant persecution. When what you really have in both cases, in the imperial context in particular, is hierarchies. One faith is on top, one faith is not. But in the middle, everyday experience is all different kinds of ways of living amongst one another. There's one good quote also that I think about from the book here on the right. It's a very important study, one of the first recent studies of indigenous Greek Orthodox of Istanbul, called the Romi, or the Rum in Turkish, the Romans, they still call the Romans, the Byzantines, the last few Greeks in Istanbul. In 2006, an historic conference was held in Istanbul that marked the revival of publishing and cultural activity of the small number of indigenous Greek Orthodox remaining in that city. They used to be 25% of Istanbul's population in 1900. They're now somewhere in the order of 0.001% or 0.01% of the city's population because of the violence I talked about. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the most prominent hierarch in the whole of the Eastern Orthodox faith, is himself a member of the indigenous Greek Orthodox of modern Turkey. And he gave the opening address at this 2006 conference, where he said, quote, "When viewed from a perspective beyond place and time, meaning a perspective that is grounded in eternity, all human beings in this world are, quote, foreigners and migrants," sort of terms of derision that are normally directed towards Greeks by native Turks. "But with respect to rights and responsibilities, as Rum, as the native Greeks of Istanbul, we are neither guests nor foreigners nor migrants in Istanbul. We know well where we come from." And that's, again, the kind of thing I'm talking about, this awareness, this long cultural memory, preserving a sense of we have been together for centuries and we remember all different kinds of things, everything from living with neighbors who, we share Ramadan celebration together, or there was violence against one another, or we had a business together, we intermarried, all these different kinds of things. And this is the major contrast with what Western Christian experience that I've been talking about. So this produces what I call a different kind of theologizing, where for Eastern Orthodox living among Muslims and vice versa, they did not and could not suspend their prior theological commitments when interacting with each other. So there's no situation where if you're living for centuries amongst one another, you can decide to stop thinking about your theology when you talk to somebody else, like the Western academic could. You can't do that. It's not sustainable for centuries on end. But they also have to find a way to explain how it's normal and acceptable that they are living so closely together and always have. From their perspective, always have. That's what I call a theology of shared lives, where you are intentionally preserving your own worldview in a way that respects someone else's. So a lot of what I'm thinking about here comes from an important book that I want to recommend to everyone, that I recommend all the time. You talked to me for 10 seconds on this, I've already recommended it to you. By Anastasios Yadolatos of Albania, the Archbishop of Albania, the Eastern Orthodox Archbishop of Albania, who in my view has produced the most important contemporary theological work on this question of Eastern Orthodox Muslim relationships. His work has been inspired by his own personal experience as a leader of the Eastern Orthodox community of Albania, who constitute one of the largest minority religious communities in that country after Sunni Islam. The way I talk about this is a deliberate extension of something he calls the dialogue of life, something that Eastern Orthodox have that Western Christians don't, the experience of living again with Muslims and knowing what that is like as two communities together. So let me read quickly some summaries of his point of view that's sort of informing how I'm thinking about this. His theology achieved its first sort of outline in an important article that's been reprinted, expanded, and translated from the original German many times. He gave this presentation in Vienna in 1986, published then in 1991. And the article is reprinted here in Facing the World. This is from this recent publication, I think in 2003. His text is called Dialogue with Islam from an Orthodox Point of View. And he reflects on his own academic training, which has both Western religious studies in Germany and Eastern Orthodox theology as a theologian. He's devoted himself to reviving Orthodox life in Albania after decades of severe repression under the atheist dictatorship of the 20th century. And he describes his efforts as fostering human rights and civic participation of religious identity, not just for Orthodox, but also Sunni Muslims who are their neighbors and their people who they live with. His whole theology of interreligious relations is based on a specific Eastern Orthodox theory of salvation, called theosis or deification, which in the modern Orthodox understanding in particular is talking about salvation as union with God or participation in the divine nature. He emphasizes that in every human being, there's a natural inclination toward communion with God that's shared among all human beings on the basis of simply being who they are as human beings. In his words, we can see religious experiences as humanity's deep longing and search for the supreme reality, and also as rays of light that people have absorbed from God's universal and divine radiance. He makes it clear that this means that Muslims and Christians are both capable of having authentic communion with God within their own traditions, and that this possibility is based in their own human nature that God made for that purpose. He also emphasized that therefore how he thinks about the Holy Spirit can cross all kinds of human boundaries that human beings see as impassable, and that all manifestations of truth in this world, including in the lives of non-Christians, are manifestations of the Holy Spirit, whose light is subject to no human restriction. He does say there's only one border, quote, that the deifying energies of the Holy Spirit cannot cross, and that's the boundary of human arrogance. Communion with God is available to all who freely desire it, only absent when it is rejected consciously by a human being. So the aesthetic spirituality of theosis comes in here because we have, as a human being, we have to consciously resist the tendency of pride and egotism, because this is what fuels religion as a vehicle for violence and evil. He has a famous metaphor here that he draws directly from Orthodox spirituality. He says, religion is like holy oil, like chrism. You can use it either to heal wounds or to burn fire. And you have to choose which one you're going to do it with. And all human beings have this religious inclination to achieve union with God, and they can either use that inclination to heal each other or to set fire to things. Because of the potential for divine communion that exists, that constitutes the essence of religion itself, is freely available to all human beings, its potential can be abused by the choice to do evil. As he says, quote, no one has the right to use the holy oil of religion to intensify the flame of armed conflicts, but instead should use it as a divine gift to soothe the hearts, heal the wounds, and bring individuals together in peace. And for what it's worth, the same language actually showed up in paragraph 16 of the encyclical issued by the Pan-Orthodox Council of Crete in 2016, which states in part, quote, the oil of faith must be used to soothe and heal the wounds of others, not to rekindle new fires of hatred. So just step back for a second. What I want to point out here is that when he talks about this topic, he takes what we might think of as vintage, pure Eastern Orthodox ways of talking about religion. He doesn't step back from them at all. And he says, this is how you can use to understand someone else, to take your own tradition's concepts, don't change them, but just see how they're already saying something else about someone else. It's already there for you. You don't have to rethink your doctrine, your dogma. Just see how the doctrine dogma is already saying something about someone else that respects who they are already. You just haven't seen it yet, but it's already there. So he takes the idea of Christian salvation for the Orthodox as theosis and uses it as a universal theory of all religion that preserves its own sense of self, its own sense of uniqueness, but then talks about how others are engaging in the same process to a degree that we can't talk about explicitly, but it's not really our business to anyway. It's not our problem, frankly. And he draws us explicitly from what he calls, quote, the dialogue of life, that the ethic of a lived reality where Muslims and Orthodox Christians recognize their common human nature as religious beings who are all striving to connect with God and with one another, but without attempting to minimize genuine theological difference. One final quote from him before I move to some examples. Our goal should be to help our own communities look with understanding and respect at the uniqueness and rights of people with different religious convictions. Each religious community should develop all that is best, all that is deepest, and all that is most beautiful within its own tradition in order to approach the wider community. So basically what's happening here is Western models of comparative theology typically ask that you rethink your approach to doctrine, you reframe how you think about doctrine, you develop your doctrine in some way as a result of encountering someone else. But what I'm trying to, or even more so, secular approaches to comparative studies often ask you to suspend that entirely. Step back, bracket your pre-existing theology to understand someone else. What he's doing here, what I think you can find in the Eastern Christian tradition is You can't do that for years and years and years because you have to be who you are every day. And everyone else wants to be that way too. The Muslims and Orthodox around you want the same thing. So you develop a method whereby you take what you already believe to be true. You don't fundamentally alter it radically, but you look at it and say, how can me being this allow me to respect something else that's very different? And develop a way to respect something that's very different, but not change what they believe or change what I believe. I was reading a book a couple of days ago. This is way off script, but whatever. About in the middle of the 19th century, the Russian Empire was having this problem where they had about three centuries previous, they'd forcibly converted a bunch of Tatar Muslims, but they didn't like this, the Tatars, so they kind of never practiced Orthodox in the first place. They kind of just kept doing Islam, and the empire was like, this is the problem. So they wanted to go back and re-missionize them and get them to be more Orthodox again, if they could. But when they got to these villages that had both Orthodox and Muslims living near Kazan, in this part of the Russian Empire, they were interviewing local inhabitants, and the local Orthodox, to the dismay of the imperial center, really couldn't care less about converting the Tatars. They were busy with other things. And one of the sort of ethnographers employed by the Russian Empire to sort of interview the local Orthodox villagers recorded a quote. This is a book by Elena Campbell called it'll come to me in like 5 minutes. Just give me a second, right? But the book is by Elena Campbell. And so these ethnographers, these scholars from the Imperial Center from St. Petersburg were interviewing local Orthodox villagers, like, why don't you want to spread the faith? We have all these Tatars we tried to convert. We forced them to be baptized 200 years ago. What are you doing out here? Why aren't you helping us out? And they had a quote from an old village woman who said, I think the Muslims should have their way and the Russians should have their way. That's it. Just leave me alone. So that's what I'm talking about here, developing this kind of way of looking at the world where you don't compromise your basic theological convictions, but you also have no fundamental interest, or you're not thinking primarily in terms of changing somebody else. That's the only way you can live among people that are truly different for a long period of time. Finally, and most importantly, I want to close with these two historical examples where Eastern Orthodox Christians and Muslims spoke in a very specifically theological voice from the position of their shared life with one another, with this theology of shared lives I'm talking about. These examples come from the Arabic language Orthodox theology in the Muslim Abbasid Empire over 1,000 years ago, and one little glimpse of something I think is interesting in contemporary Ukraine. My first example here is from the work of a theologian named Theodore Abu Qurra, who lived around 755 to 830. He lived in the Abbasid Empire, which was this vast territory ruled by Muslim emperors or caliphs, with its capital at Baghdad. And you all, if you've ever seen Aladdin, you've been exposed to something about this, because the whole Aladdin, all the Aladdin stuff, it's a distant echo of a previous Arabic text. Anyways, all the Aladdin stuff is alluding to the Abbasid Caliphate, this huge, massive imperial power over what that achieved sort of its height between the 7 and the 9, 1000s, and passed into Western and Middle Eastern folklore for that reason. But during this time period, this is a very diverse and cosmopolitan society. Whole provinces of that empire, like the Ottomans later, were not Muslim. In fact, the majority of the empire was not Muslim for 200 or 300 years after it was founded. And Theodore was a member of the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox Christians living in that empire, who had, by the time he was around born in the middle of the 700s, he had been born and raised completely in this Abbasid Arabic-speaking milieu. His Orthodox friends and family around him had also never known anything else but the Abbasid Empire, but they were practitioners of Byzantine Eastern Orthodoxy. So they developed their own theology in Arabic, their own way of life that was very distinctive from their co-religious next door in the Byzantine Empire. Famously, in another really important book written by a guy named Konstantin Panchenko, translated last year, published by the Holy Trinity Press up in Jordanville, New York, relates how when parts of these Muslim territories that have been ruled by the Abbasid caliphs for a couple hundred years, when they were reconquered, I think in the 12th century, the 11th century, by the Byzantines, the Byzantine Greek-speaking Orthodox were like, how cool is this? You must be so happy. Now you get to speak Greek. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. They developed, the Arabic-speaking Orthodox that have been descendants of communities like his just persisted in their own Middle Eastern ways, doing their own Arabic thing. And they were happy part of Christian empire because they became part of the ruling class again. So that was cool. But they didn't change from being Arabic speaking, Middle Eastern practicing, and they sort of kept themselves separate from the Greek speaking Byzantines because they were from a different place at that point. Theodore was from Edessa, which is now Şanlıurfa in Turkey. His native language is Syriac, but he was the first theologian whose name that has come down to us, who wrote primarily in Arabic. So he basically wrote Christianity in Arabic for the first time that we know, whose name we have earlier texts than his, but we don't know who wrote them. But he's the first person we know who in Arabic sat down and began to write Orthodox theology or Christianity in general. He had some colleagues from other Christian denominations as well, the Church of the East, and also the Miaphysite Church, the Jacobites. But he had networks and sort of like a scholarly community. He had colleagues in places from Palestine to Edessa to Antioch, Baghdad, Damascus, Alexandria. He was part of this wide network of intellectual activity. He had Muslim colleagues who wrote refutations of his work. He was a member of these circles of the Abbasid cities where members of all faiths would get together and debate their worldviews. And these circles of interfaith sort of academic debate produced a style of theology in Arabic called kalam, meaning dialectic or sort of discussion. And he wrote a distinctive kind of Eastern Orthodox kalam theology in Arabic, where he used pure reason and human nature to try and prove the tenets of Greek patristic theology and spirituality, which is an odd thing for a Byzantine style theologian to do. But the style of this theology, kalam theology, we have tons of accounts of this. It was sort of a routine intellectual feature of life in the Abbasid Caliphate, because you had people who were, from one end of the empire to the other. You had everything from Buddhists to various kinds of Muslims, of course, who were the ruling class, 3 or 4 different kinds of Christian groups. You had a couple of different kinds of Jewish denominations and all kinds of religions that don't even exist anymore, like Manichaeism in some places. And so what they would do is they would gather in the same room in this sort of salon type setting, and they would agree that we're going to debate our faiths, but we cannot refer to any one scripture because none of us agree on a scripture. So that's out. So whatever you believe, because I thought this was a fun, intellectual activity like this, right? But whatever you prove, whatever you say you think is true, including the Muslims, most especially the Muslims, you can't refer to the Quran, the Bible, the whatever. You have to do it from pure reason, just from things we all know from being human beings. And so Theodore developed a style of Orthodox theology where he tries to prove what we would think of as like very distinctive Byzantine ideas like theosis, but from reason and experience, not referring to and he would say over and over again, proudly, I'm not referring to the fathers or the scripture. Look, I can do it without that stuff. How cool is that? That was his, but his whole point was, but if you use the reason, then you see why the gospel is true. So he would make points like his treatises devoted to showing that Eastern Orthodox Christianity is the only religion whose scriptures and doctrines can be confirmed by, quote, the rule of reason. And he exhorts his Orthodox to embrace this method so that they can defend and articulate their faith in a majority Muslim society. To quote him again, God will unceasingly raise up for orthodoxy those who vouch for it from reason. Which again, thinking about modern Orthodox theology today, it's not how we talk about it. We think of that as a very Enlightenment, Western, not great thing to do. Just to give one example from his work, he has a pretty large body of works, and everything he tries to prove things like the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, theosis. He even tries to make a rational proof for why we should believe the ecumenical councils, which is kind of wild. And so I'll give one example of these, where he says that you can prove not only Christian salvation, but you can prove the Orthodox version of Christian salvation of deification using reason. He says, think of it this way, because at this point, he feels like he's proved the existence of God. God created human beings to desire the enjoyment of life to the fullest extent possible, which we observe. So he basically says, if you think about the way you're made, every human being wants to have good experiences all the time. None of us want to have a good experience followed by a bad experience. None of us want to die. Therefore, we all want to live forever. We have this natural desire to have unending enjoyment, unending good experiences. And this is part of the way God made us. God obviously made us this way Therefore, God would not frustrate this desire, because to do so would go against God's nature as generous and as loving to humanity. But if we're going to be eternal, we can only get the attribute of eternality from where it exists by itself in the divine nature. Therefore, we're created to be united with God and participate in the divine nature. So we're created to want to live forever. God wouldn't make us that way if he wasn't going to allow us to do that. Therefore, we're created to experience deification and theosis. He has this metaphor where he says it's like thirsting in the desert. If you almost die of thirst in the desert, your desire after, therefore, is not to I'm glad that I could drink water and I wouldn't mind experiencing that again. Your desire is to never have that experience again, ever again. You don't want to feel that ever again. And he says that feeling that you have after you drink water from almost dying in the desert, and the feeling to never have it again, those feelings prove that God made us to be united with God. Because the only way you can have unending enjoyment is if you're united with the source of that, which is God's nature. So God grants us the means to attain eternal life, and God grants us the desire to do so. And he argues that you can arrive at that Eastern Orthodox theological, Byzantine theological schema without ever having to go to Scripture. You can see it in Scripture. His point is you can see it there, so our Scripture is true. But his argument is that if you just think about what it means to be human, you will get to my doctrine, and then you can see it in the gospel after you get to it with your reason, and just by thinking about what it means to live as a human person. The second example, and so interestingly also as well, this is just an image of one of his treatises, a manuscript, a late 9th century manuscript. Theodore also is interesting because he was famous for centuries. I mean, he inaugurated a whole school of Orthodox theology that has basically been dead for centuries, but he was famous for a long time. His stuff was recopied in the Middle East for many centuries. He had a lot of influence, but his whole style of theology it died out somewhere in the 18th century and hasn't ever been taken up again, unfortunately. So read my article, is what I'm saying. But weirdly enough, and Scott Christian Zahner figured this out, not me. The Orthodox Church commemorates him every year without knowing it, because his life passed into a legendary life of someone named Theodore of Edessa, who in legends converts a Muslim caliph to Orthodoxy. That, friends, did not happen, I'm here to tell you. But aside from him doing things like converting the caliph, all the details of Theodore of Edessa match perfectly with Theodore of Aquitera, especially being from Edessa. And we know that he was beloved and venerated in the place that he was from. So the fact that someone wrote a saint life for him makes sense, but it got covered over by legend over many centuries. But every July, he's commemorated in the Eastern Orthodox calendar, and he's got an icon here from the OCA, Orthodox Church in America. But I don't think, except for Christian Zahner and me, or someone else who reads Christian Zahner's books, people don't know that we're actually commemorating Theodore of Aquitera every July. The second example I have here is from contemporary Ukraine. This is a statement from an organization called the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, or UKRO. In 1996, UKRO was founded as a representative of over a dozen of the largest faith communities in Ukraine, including a wide variety of Christian denominations, Judaism, and Islam. It's basically the most important voice regarding formal religious communities in Ukrainian civil society, the major intermediary between them and the Ukrainian government. This is a part of post-Soviet Ukraine's notably high level of religious diversity, which many scholars have pointed out is somewhat unique to Ukraine in the post-Soviet space, and the corresponding vibrancy of debates on religious freedom, democratization, Europeanization that have gone on in Ukraine for upwards of 20 years. UKRO advocates consistently for conservative religious morality in Ukrainian public policy, and also affirms Ukraine's efforts to adopt European Union standards of democratization and human rights. So it tries to articulate a broad interreligious message that advocates for a sort of conservative moral voice in Ukrainian society, but also affirms Ukrainian patriotism and a commitment to democratization and even adherence to European Union standards along those lines. It's a really helpful phrase here coming from Natalia Shapovalova. We can think of them as value-oriented conservatives, in her phrase, who are, quote, nonviolent and support democratic values, who contrast themselves with the far right. But interestingly, as another scholar who's worked a lot on contemporary Ukrainian religion, Andrei Kravchuk, has said, quote, "The Ukros with terms of reference do not foresee a dialogue that would focus on core theological beliefs with the goal of religious rapprochement, and no such dialogue is planned." So Ukro is a civil society organization in Ukraine that represents every major faith there, Muslims, Jews, Christians of different kinds. They put out comment statements about all kinds of things, social, political, whatever, but they don't do religious dialogue. They're not interested in it. They simply are not curious to do that kind of thing. They don't see it as necessary, which is part of what I'm sort of thinking about here. So Ukraine is a majority Orthodox nation with some 2/3 of its population professing Orthodox Christianity. It's also home to an indigenous Muslim minority, the Crimean Tatars. And so Orthodox and the Tatar Muslims in Ukrainian territory and of former Russian Empire have the same kind of complexity of interaction that I talked about that you find in other post-imperial societies like former Ottoman territory as well. And the fact that such an organization focuses on producing a united voice on social issues, but not theological ones, is indicative of the kind of approach I'm describing. They want to have a social voice. They want to protect the interests of different religious groups. They're explicitly pluralist in the way they talk about religious traditions in the country. They don't advocate for religious supremacy of any faith whatsoever. They are not interested in changing each other's theology in the slightest, or even learning too much about it necessarily. Because it's the job of each tradition to do that for themselves. And the job of them to come together in civil society and advocate on behalf of the common good, something greater. And it might, I can't prove this, but it seems unique, if not unprecedented, to have this kind of interaction among Orthodox and Muslims in Orthodox history, where they're both part of a panel working in tandem with the state without either having state supremacy, but also working for a common vision politically. So one example of their statements, a very recent one that I pulled out here because it's so recent, is a statement they put out very quickly after the revelation of genocidal war crimes committed by Russian forces in the Kyiv region, suburb of Bucha, following the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022. This statement singled out a particular ideology as responsible for the invasion, what many Orthodox scholars have called Ruski Mir, or this way of talking about a kind of structural religious nationalism and imperialism that some Orthodox scholars posit as responsible for the invasion of Ukraine most recently by the I almost said Russian Empire. We'll go with it, the Russian Empire. It's the same thing. What's interesting here is that this is the term used by Orthodox theologians to critique other parts of Orthodoxy, but the statement was released by a panel that included Muslims. And so they're all together entering into an intra-Orthodox debate about that faith. This term, for some context about the Ruski Mir critique, it was elaborated particularly by Ukrainian Orthodox theologians like Archpriest and theologian Cyril Hovorun, who's been talking about this particular issue over the past 10 years, particularly because he was a voice for political theologies of democracy following the Euromaidan protests of 2013, 2014. And his critique has been most influential in talking about the sort of potential religious ideological motivations that may have gone into the 2022 invasion. In their collective statement, Ukro calls for, this is the statement here that I just have a picture of. Ukro calls on the whole world to, quote, condemn the ideology of the Ruski Mir as one that is justifying genocide of peoples and the destruction of entire states. So what's happening here is that Orthodox and Muslims are getting together to speak in the theology of shared life that's very urgent, a defense of their shared nation, a defense of life itself in the face of an unprecedented existential threat. The argument they're making is very specific. God is on Ukraine's side, which is a very specific contextual argument, but these are the kind of arguments that I think make all the difference and make all the difference to people actually living together in these societies. So if Theodore 1,000 years ago wants to argue that Orthodoxy has this perfectly rational way of looking at the world, you can use reason to talk about our faith in a sophisticated setting. This argument is God supports Ukraine in the war. And both of these arguments are very specific to their context. They're coming out of a specific context. What I'm trying to say is those specific arguments are where you most commonly actually see interreligious contact happening. It's much more common historically than comparative theology about doctrine. It's people talking from their own societies how to live. So my argument here very quickly that when we're looking for ways to interpret Muslim-Christian relations, we should look for moments where they collaborate or have shared experiences on things that matter deeply to their everyday lives. In these two examples from the medieval Abbasid Empire, that might be phrased as, quote, the argument there from Theodore, Orthodox Christianity is entirely compatible with and discoverable by human reason experience alone. From contemporary Ukraine, the argument is, from Ukro, God is on Ukraine's side. One, very universal, the other very contextual, but they both have deep, serious, life-altering ramifications for people living in that context. So my point here is not to downplay traditional, sort of more traditional approach of comparative theology or religious studies, but to assert that genuine theologies that are built on deep interreligious relationships probably occur most often not when you're trying to find a compromise or common ground on dogma, but when you're trying to build a better future for your community. So interreligious theologies, it seems to me, from the Eastern Christian experience in particular, occur most frequently in everyday interactions that go totally unnoticed by academic discourse, but it's those interactions that actually have determined the past, the present, and the future of interfaith relationships. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you. Questions?
Go for it, John Doyle.
Thank you. Several things come to mind.
Yeah.
First of all, beginning with the last verse. What they released.
Yeah, Ukro. Yep.
Okay. Obviously, from your point of view, and I would agree, this is a very positive sort of example of people living together and confronting a situation.
Yeah.
Has there been people that are doing the other, which is they're on the outside in the United States, for example, or in Western Europe or whatever, looking at what those folks did with these sorts of statements, and have they reacted the other way, which is why are these Muslims saying this along with these Orthodox Christians? Why are these Catholics saying this along with these Jews? And has there been any reaction like that? And perhaps how has the Russian Empire reacted? And they look, I'm sure they would be against this sort of statement.
They have opinions, yeah.
But when they look at it too and say, well, whatever's coming out of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they got Muslims that are saying things with them. So we're good.
But yeah, so it's a very good point. The question, I mean, so there's a lot of debate over whether, not unlike critiques of Islamic extremism or terrorism produced by jihadist groups in the Middle East, there's all kinds of debates over, is the motivation for Russian violence here religious or not? So a lot of Orthodox wonder if even calling it religious violence is even helpful framing at all. So there's a lot of arguments against, should we even talk about this as a religious war from the Russian perspective, even though it's supported by the Patriot. It has a lot of religious language for sure. So the question is, what do you do with that? There's critiques on that side. Interestingly, from what this is a little bit of field for my area, but just for comparison here, from what I understand, Russian state ideology right now is very much that we defend conservative religious morality wherever it's found. And we're happy to have that support from Muslims as well. So what's happened in Russia and Ukraine is that the Russian establishment in Russia has lined up equally quickly on side of Russians as the Orthodox Church did, using the exact same discourse. So basically, we support the Russian invasion because we are also convinced that the West is so evil now to get us, we have to go fight Ukraine for some reason. So they also support that kind of discourse, and the Ukrainian Muslims are on the side of the Ukrainian government. So Russia actually doesn't seem to. Russia wants to have that internal Muslim support for one reason, because they're drafting Muslims at a much higher rate than Orthodox. For one thing, it's the ethnic minorities in the Russian state that are being used to fight the war at a much higher proportion than ethnic Russian. If you look at a map of like draftees, Moscow, St. Petersburg, not very many people. If you look at territories with Muslims and Buddhists living in them, they're getting drafted in huge numbers because they can't fight back basically. And that actually is very imperial. I mean, that's exactly how the Ottomans worked with their soldiers sometimes, and that's how the Russian Empire worked too. So it also shows this kind of sense of the Russian Empire, the Russian state has no problem with Muslims living there as long as they're subordinate. We do what we tell them to do. And so the contrast there, so the contrast between Russia and Ukraine is not so much between one is pro-Islam or anti-Islam. It's, do you want to have a state where the state tells the minorities what to do and sends them to war more frequently than the Orthodox? Or do you want to have a state that produces things like this, where they're all talking together and defending this ideal that none of them have total state control, they all have the same legal rights? Unlike Russia, where Orthodox have legal privilege in many ways. Do it.
One more quick one.
By all means.
This is off the track of what you've been talking about in a way. Is there any parallel between the way these people have lived together and do, as evidenced by Ukraine, for example, and do now, and the way we in this country live with other people of different faith? Is ours politically founded, constitution, etc., or are we kind of doing the same thing? Well, I'm a Jew and I live next to a Muslim, or I'm an Orthodox and live next to a Lutheran. Are we doing the same thing here in a way, or is it's just a different?
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's
the same.
no, I appreciate that. I think so. Basically, the way I think about this is that honestly, the closest analogy I have to say, like the place where Theodore lived, the medieval Abbasid Caliphate, where you had a Muslim you had Muslims on top at the top of the hierarchy, like Orthodox and Russian Empire, but you'd have a town with 3 different religions and no one's a majority. I mean, it's this, and that's actually very different. From the Russian Empire had different faiths, but they tend to cluster in large swaths. But the Ottomans, the Abbasids, I mean, they would have a town or a village with like 5 different denominations all at the same time. So there was an extreme level of plurality in these Muslim territories for historical reasons. And the Muslims famously had no interest in forceful conversion. They had other ways to control their minorities, right? They, different empires pick different ways of oppressing people, right? So actually, I think the nearest analogy to the Abbasid Empire actually is the contemporary United States, or maybe Western Europe in some ways, because of just the raw number of different people living in the same place. One difference is, so there is an attempt to establish legal equality in the US or in Western Europe or elsewhere. That was never something anyone cared about before the Enlightenment, really. So these societies had no interest in legal equality. They couldn't conceive of it. So for instance, in Theodore's mind, he talked about politics, and in Theodore's mind, his complaint is that Orthodox are not the ones on top. He doesn't want equality, he wants an Orthodox empire, because that's what you want. There's no such thing as equal rights for different faiths in the medieval period anywhere in the world. Politics didn't work that way. It would be sort of like arguing in the contemporary United States that like Germans can vote in American elections. Like there has to be a boundary. And the boundary then wasn't citizenship, it was religion. So there was no equal rights that we would talk about now, but there was a high level of diversity and of people celebrating things together, like religious holidays. So there's a lot of mixing together, hierarchy, but a lot of mixing together. Now it's the opposite. We have much more legal equality, but the mixing is done, really. We actually live much more separate lives, with some exceptions, maybe large urban centers, perhaps. But we live much separate lives as different religious communities now than they did back then. So I talk to my students in like South Carolina. Imagine a place where your local Baptist church and a mosque have Christmas celebrations together in the middle of South Carolina. That's not a thing, right? Here either. You know what I mean? You don't do that out in the provinces, out in the rural territory. That's not how it works, right? But that was normal in these places for longer than anybody could remember. So I guess the comparison is that there are some parallels. The difference is legal equality is what we value now. And the sacrifice for that is you don't mix a lot. You really don't share things the way that you used to. Then hierarchy is what everybody experienced and was normal. So you didn't have the same rights as the religion on top, but you also interacted a lot more frequently and you knew each other a lot better than you maybe did now.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Is there any hope for the academic study of religion in the West, according to your analysis?
Well, I have to trash on somebody, and we're all.
Well, I asked the question because I'm thinking of someone like Raimundo Panikar, who is a marginal person, right, living, as it were, stretched between 2 traditions, the Hindu and the Catholic.
Yeah.
And he proposed something very similar in his books in writings on religious dialogue. His goal is to suggest that people, in some sense, retain their identity, but also to interact with each other over protracted periods of time. So, for example, some years ago, this was at the time of 9/11, actually, just before it and afterwards, there was an initiative on the part of the Catholic Church to do interreligious dialogue with Muslims. And I was a part of that. And it was fascinating because the way in which the sessions were set up, we worshiped with them, we ate with them. But of course, these were just for small stretches of time, 3 days at a time. And what really crystallized the interaction between the two groups, oddly enough, was 9/11. Because it was a shared experience. Right? It's a shared experience and a shared threat. And in that discussion, it really broke the ice. It was an incredible moment. But anyway, my question is, so is there a model that Westerners could try to adopt in order to better understand this?
Yeah, no, full disclosure, I'm really big into universal human rights language. I enjoy this stuff I'm a Westerner after all. I enjoy it very much, right? So I actually think that the present model of universal human rights language is simply the most effective, best way forward, because it's the way that we think of justice now. In the context of the modern state, in my opinion, someone else made this point, I can't remember who it was, so forgive me, but in the context of the modern state where the state has so much power, equality, striving for equality is the best way to preserve some kind of freedom, some kind of dignity. So that ideal, I think, is great, and the more you use it, the better. So I don't think the West has to change the way it talks about these things, but just to maybe think more. And the lesson from the Eastern experience is that you don't have to walk away from those conversations saying, I believe my Christianity different now, or my Islam. You just don't have to. You just have to think of a way where your identity allows you to basically be okay with somebody else that close to you. A lot of conversations that I've had have been like, well, I think now, I think about Christianity different. I think my doctrinal mindset is different. You just don't need to do that. You just have to have a sort of modus vivendi where you know what it means to live with each person. But it may require suspending the urge to convince them that you're right? And back and forth. And that's where it's difficult because, like you're saying, and it's true, before 9/11, Western Christians did not think much about Islam. And before, thanks to Dr. Edward Curtis, who told me about this, the Hart-Sellers Act of the mid-60s, you legally couldn't have migration of large numbers of Muslims to the United States because they were in countries that were banned from coming to America in the first place. So it's only been in the past 40 years that we have had Americans living who are Muslim and Christian together in the same place, right? That's very, very recent. But I think if you go to those communities, they're already doing this. I think people adopt this mentality immediately if you're having to live with people. And that sort of everyday common experience, I just think has some insights that you're just not going to get from where are our doctrines coinciding? It's like, I don't really care. I mean, that's not the point. The point is, how can we be us and you be you, and it doesn't threaten anybody.
My question then with that is, how does Theodore fit in that? So I mean, I love what you said about him. I think it's really interesting. So I have kind of two questions. Did we have a Muslim response to his I have the most reasonable approach? And if you just think the most logical way, clearly you'll become a Christian.
Just like me.
Which I tell my students all the time, everybody holds a view because they think it's reasonable. Nobody says I'm going to be unreasonable today.
Absolutely.
This religion. So it was a Muslim response, and then how does he fit in the argument you're making? Maybe I kind of I see him because he wants this hierarchy. Right. He's not just being the good neighbor of I'm gonna do me, you do you, and we respect each other. He thinks if everyone just thought like me, right, that I'll become really maybe Orthodox. So maybe just walk me back to that.
No, that's a good point. I think you're making the point that I should make better in that regard. I think what's interesting about him is that he's an example of how the way you talk about your faith doesn't have to change your exact doctrinal beliefs, but the way you talk about it may change radically based on where you are.
The articulation.
The articulation of it, right? So basically, the way he talks about orthodoxy to me is very unusual. And it shows that you can talk about your faith in a way that is very tailored to your context, but you're not compromising your doctrines whatsoever. But you're absolutely right. In his context, everyone, the convention of these little circles where they get together and talk to each other was that they would all make this point, and they'd be like, "Great, have a nice day," and then I'll go back to whatever they're doing. Like it was a convention of courtesy to have these intellectual events, and they made careers out of this. I mean, he made money wandering around the Abbasid Empire, giving lectures and whatever. And he also spent a lot of time trying to convince Armenians to become Eastern Orthodox, for whatever reason. And there were Muslims who wrote tracts against him, responses. He wrote responses to them. So it's almost like this is part of his professional career. And he's an academic, but he also knows that he's doing this to try and keep his fellow Christians from converting away, because there's a huge motive to do that, because it alleviates all the burdens of discrimination they're experiencing at the same time. So, in other words, the way he lives his life is an example of what it looks like, in my opinion, to have the way you talk about your faith be very, very different from what someone might be doing elsewhere, but it's tailored to your experience, but it doesn't involve compromising your core doctrinal anything really. He just repeats Byzantine orthodoxy, but he argues it for it in a way that is different. But you're right, the way he talks about his society is he definitely thinks he's right about this stuff.
So can I follow up on this?
Yeah.
So in some sense, what unites the rationality of Theodore and then the situations of these various people under different empires, it's a sort of common rule, isn't it? I mean, a common set of agreements about what's allowable, what's not allowable, and what your status is under the.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a local way of organizing these relationships. It's very based on context. I saw her hand back here in the middle. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, it sure would. He should be a saint, by the way. I agree with that. And there's some evidence that the Jerusalem church has venerated him, but I'm not sure. I'll share my screen. Am I still sharing my screen? Yes, I am. All right. There are 2 translations of his work into English. One of them's been out of print for a long time because all the good stuff's out of print. No, sadly, I know. Yeah, that'd be cool. This is, but I think if you go to University of Chicago's website, they have the licenses for this. Let me try that right now. I think Brigham Young transferred there. No. Maybe BYU Press. They transferred their imprint to Chicago at some point. There it is. Okay, it's still okay. Never mind. They still have it. Okay, cool. So you go to Brigham. Forthcoming? No, it's not. What are you talking about? Anyways, it's out there somewhere.
Is that John Lamro?
John Lamro, yeah.
He was my student.
Are you kidding? That's cool.
He and I were pretty good friends.
I'm glad. That's awesome. This is out there. You can either get it from BYU, Brigham Young University Press, or Chicago University Press. University of Chicago Press has it somehow. But this is a collection of his treatises, all of the major ones in Arabic into English. It's a very good book. You can find it, but it takes some effort, unfortunately. And then a second translation of one of his treatises is much more easily available in paperback by the great Sidney Griffith. His treatise on the veneration of holy icons, but also includes a summary of his life in the beginning. So this is probably the easiest way to start. It says, he talks about all of his major themes, reason, orthodoxy, whatever, in this book right here, $25. It's a great translation, and it has a biography of him in the beginning. So that's a good place to start, I suppose. And the thing to remember about him that's so interesting is that, unfortunately, a lot of people who have read him have basically dismissed him as like a repeater of Byzantine stuff in Arabic. But if you're familiar with the Islamic theology that he's talking to, he's using a bunch of Muslim terms, a bunch of Muslim ideas, because he's trying to speak to Muslims. And so he winds up doing something, I think, quite a bit different, which is why he talks about reason and human nature over and over and over again, and stuff like that. I appreciate everyone coming. For the rest of your evening.
Thank you.